What is extraordinary about this situation is that here you have, particularly the British, seeing the Jewish world as one collective monolithic entity. And in that sense, they start looking at the role of the Jews in the war as being something which might be important. And from the point of view of the Allies, something else quite remarkable, this monolithic collective entity is pro-German.
Many Jews in the upper echelons of German society did indeed have close connections to the Kaiser's Foreign Office. A new Jewish nationalist movement, Zionism, had also been able to establish its headquarters in Berlin. Zionism had originated in the 1880s, after Theodor Herzl published a book espousing the virtues of a Jewish state. This caused a sensation amongst Jewish intellectuals in Germany, Austria and Russia, who shared Herzl's outrage at the escalation of anti-Jewish sentiments.
The end of the 19th century saw the rise of anti-Semitism all over Europe, in Austria, in Germany, in France, but particularly in Eastern Europe, in Poland and in Russia. And the pogrom against the Jews in Russia gave rise to the establishment of Hovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, societies in a number of Russian cities who started to promote and to finance and to sponsor colonization, emigration to Palestine. Herzl came to the conclusion that the Jews were not safe anywhere in Europe, and the only solution was for the Jews to have a state of their own over which they could exercise sovereignty and where they would not be a minority.
What had also given Zionism its appeal was the way in which it fitted in to historic Jewish aspirations. Scattered throughout the world, since the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in the 1st century AD, many Jews had cherished the idea of returning one day to what their scriptures had told them was the Promised Land. In fact, there had already been a small community of indigenous Jews in Palestine. But even when some European Jews established settlements throughout the late 19th century, the whole Jewish community by 1914 constituted barely 8% of the population. The Zionist leader in Britain, Chaim Weizmann, had been lobbying the government for a guarantee that in the event of an Ottoman defeat, it would support Jewish emigration to Palestine. By early 1917, Lloyd George's view of Jews as globally influential convinced him that Zionism was another nationalist movement which should be co-opted to the Allied cause. In March, Mark Sykes began negotiations with Weizmann.
There is a bee in the bonnet of people like Mark Sykes that actually the Jews do ultimately look to each other and look to their own interest. And if that interest, as they are being told by Weizmann, is what we really want is Palestine, they're prepared to believe it. They're prepared to go along with it.
As negotiations with Weizmann continued over the following months, the war deteriorated rapidly for the Allies. The German submarine campaign was seriously weakening Britain's merchant fleet, and although America had entered the war on the Allied side, President Woodrow Wilson was not yet willing to supply a significant number of troops. Britain's latest attempt to keep up the pressure on the Western Front soon became bogged down in the muddy trenches of Passchendaele. As thousands of young men's lives were wasted in another fruitless campaign, morale amongst the soldiers plummeted. But the most serious threat to the Allied war machine came from the east. Russia was on the verge of collapse. After massive defeats at the hands of the Germans, the war-weary country was disintegrating, with food shortages, strikes and demonstrations. When the Tsar was deposed in a revolution, Britain and France became greatly alarmed.
The point is that once Russia and its war effort begins to collapse, essentially the Germans have won the First World War unless they bring the Americans in. There's no way that the British and the French on their own are ever going to defeat Germany.
In October, the British government received an intelligence report suggesting that Jews were a significant influence in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the new revolutionary movement emerging as the dominant force in Russia. Lloyd George feared that these communists would take Russia out of the war. With the Americans still refusing to commit sufficient forces, he knew it was time to act. He instructed his Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to issue a pledge to capture the hearts and minds of the Jewish people.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievements of this object.
The Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917, just as British forces were occupying Palestine.
I would say that the Balfour Declaration has to be understood not as an idealistic gesture, but it has to be understood within the framework of British imperial policy, and Lloyd George was the main instigator of that declaration because he believed that it would serve Britain's interests.
But this was also the first time that any major European power had given official backing for the Zionist goal of making Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Yet Sheriff Hussein had understood that Palestine had been promised as part of his deal for Arab independence. Anticipating Arab outrage at the prospect of a Jewish homeland in a largely Arab province, the Balfour Declaration had also stated that
nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The declaration, nonetheless, appeared to indicate British support for Jewish emigration.
There were only a mere 80,000 out of some like 700,000 people in Palestine who were Jews. The indigenous inhabitants of Palestine were referred to as non-Jewish inhabitants, and that Palestine was being identified even at that stage as a Jewish land, and all the others had no defined identity. They were simply non-Jewish.
The Balfour Declaration was what it says, a declaration. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't a signed agreement, it was a declaration in support of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
In fact, the only treaty Britain had signed in regard to Palestine was with the French, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. On November the 7th, within a few days of the Balfour Declaration, the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. Lloyd George hoped that it would have the desired effect of appeasing the Jews in the communist leadership.
What is it that they supposedly so want, as Jews? Palestine. Now, the whole argument is totally illogical. It's a nonsense argument because these particular people, if one were to think of people like Trotsky or Zinoviev or Yaffe, some of the key Jewish leaders in the Russian Revolution, the November Revolution, these people, of course, are internationalists.
There were 15 to 20 Jews in the higher echelons of the Bolshevik party. Most of them were anti-Zionist, and after they came to power, soon after they came to power, they issued a declaration to say that Zionism is a capitalist ploy, a capitalist idea.